what skills are required? Are private equity now able to hire more talented and more niche skills?
Having some level of technical skills or even be really good at AI prompts might be a way to set yourself forward. But then there's also the thing where like the sales skills, the relationship building skills might also become more important than ever.
Talk to me a little bit about on-cycle recruiting at private equity and what you're seeing right now.
Everyone wants the best talent. And if they go, well, then I have to go. You know, if they're in it, then I need to be in it. Whoever's first to get the best person. What happens is you're now recruiting people without any idea of how they operate in the real world.
Private equity versus private credit. Is private credit at risk of a bubble?
Here's the one prediction I'll make.
Go ahead. Private equity versus private credit. Where's the money going? Who or what is at risk? My guest today is Alex Nicoll, private equity and private credit beat writer and journalist from Business Insider. Today, we do our best to answer those exact questions. We also get into the aggressive dynamics of PE recruiting and what the impacts to on-cycle recruiting changes mean for talent in the industry. So it's 2026. Private equity is in a different state. It seems like whenever the calendar changes, anything in any market is just automatically in a new phase. Where is the money in private equity going right now?
It continues to kind of flow into a lot of the places it has over the last couple of years, but I think even a lot of those strategies are becoming even kind of more pronounced. So, you know, it's the kind of the same story in some ways as a lot of the economy, which is AI data centers. And specifically for private equity, you know, they're not taking as many bets on kind of more speculative things, as in like literally underlying LLMs or software companies around that are kind of, you know, built on top of AI. What they're focused on is kind of a term that I just hear nonstop at this point in the industry: picks and shovels. The idea is essentially you can kind of sum it up, and there's a Blackstone advertisement. You know, now that they're pushing more into private wealth, they've been advertising more on TV, and they have this advertisement of the gold rush. You know, the California gold rush in the 1800s. And they're the ones selling. They're not the ones out there digging the gold. They're the ones selling the picks and shovels, the tools with which the gold will be dug. So what does that mean in this world? I mean, a lot of it means infrastructure. There's kind of the first line infrastructure of buying a literal data center and building and or developing the land for a literal data center. There's all of the companies that build all of the components inside of these data centers as well. You know, you have, again, they're not like buying a chip manufacturer. They're looking at the company that makes this one specific, you know, element of a chip, or even something that's in the supply chain to make a specific element of a chip. And so what they're betting on is kind of, the underlying real world things that are powering the kind of AI boom. That also means that they're looking at energy investments. So this is an incredibly energy heavy kind of transformation of the economy. You know, we already have a very energy heavy economy, but it's even kind of gone into overdrive. And now, you know, obviously that's on top of now a war threatening energy supplies. So that might change this entire equation. But I kind of, there's like one transaction that was talked about last week that's like a good example of this and shows kind of how this investment has already been such a successful investment while firms are still pouring money into it. So KKR announced last week that they exited a transaction for a cooling company that essentially builds things that cool the processors in a data center. Yes. They're named Cool It. Really great, really creative naming there.
Apropos.
And you got to love it. And they bought that in 2023. And they've now returned a 15x return selling it in 2026. So they are getting basically the entire mandate of their fund. It was kind of a small, like impact-ish focused fund. They're returning that entire mandate of that fund with one transaction. Now, obviously, you know, that doesn't mean every transaction is going to be this good, but that's kind of the like salivating, you know, the opportunity that's having people salivate.
Yes.
And then there's kind of the side note here, which is like people are really worried about software, and we can kind of get into that more later. But that's kind of creating this term that, you know, it's not just in private equity. It's been talked about a lot of places, but the term is halo assets, heavy asset, low obsolescence, essentially assets that are real world things. They're not like a customer stream that can be taken by AI. They're real world physical objects
Hmm.
that are hard to replace in the financial system or in you know the supply chain of data centers.
Right.
Now, what's interesting again, there's this kind of war threatening, a energy supply and the cost of energy, and b the access to physical assets that are
Mhm.
required to or raw material that's required to create physical assets. So who knows what that means in the future? That could also slow down the kind of AI improvements because we just don't have the energy to throw into this. So, you know, we might, to go back to your original question, we might have multiple changes in one calendar year. Lucky us. Well, the world is keeping us on our toes.
As it always does. Data center seems to be the operative word. In fact, at Selby Jennings here, we are working with, you mentioned data centers, kind of digital infrastructure build outs. We're seeing the same thing. We're working with some large private equity companies that are investing in digital infrastructure type assets, whether they are specific to data centers or, the kind of like fiber optic or other digital infrastructure assets, and that does seem to be a lot of where that money is going. The real assets, whereas more on the banking side or the tech side, not necessarily with regards to PE, but those are the companies that are investing in the software, as you say, right? They're optimizing and augmenting their internal systems. They're building the LLMs. Private equity is not necessarily trying to get in as much on that per se as they are the actual physical assets and infrastructure at this time.
Exactly. No, 100%. And I think it's the idea is like the specialists at making money on picking the right tech companies are the venture capital firms or,
Right.
and at this point, I mean, the fundraising for your kind of two big players here is just absurd. It's like never been seen before in kind of the venture and, pre-IPO market.
Hmm.
Um, and, I think for a lot of them, like a lot of us, in late 2022, early 2023, when kind of GPT had like a big kind of step forward, they also were a little bit caught off guard. And then we're like, okay, it's already a little too late to like pick the winners and it's too risky to pick the winners, this kind of money that are I mean, we're talking OpenAI and Anthropic, really, like the big companies doing this. But what they can do is all of the physical world that sits behind it. Exactly. So that's where the industry kind of pushes has happened. And what's interesting now is kind of maybe this will get us into talking about, the big kind of topic in my beat as of late, private credit. It's
Hmm.
also on the credit side, a lot of the money is going in that direction lately. So my while I was out recently on parental leave, my colleagues put out a list. Well, they just came out, but they had worked on it while I was out of office on
Sure.
kind of the big credit players in the digital infrastructure place. Both private credit and kind of traditional banks that are also lending or creating syndicated loans
Hmm.
to lend. And that is both. There's a huge credit push for specifically digital infrastructure and then more broadly again for like asset based finance, so like real assets, putting the money into a physical thing because there's this big concern that like putting money into a business that is a software business, especially a SaaS business, that's just like a stream of income and a product. The worry is that the AI is going to either the companies itself will be able to develop software using the AI, using vibe coding, et cetera, the LLMs to build that internally, or the LLMs themselves will be so good at doing this stuff that why would you ever pay a third party when you could just pay Anthropic for this? So that same kind of turn to the real world is happening again, with this all added backdrop of like who knows, we could be facing now a, supply side, like physical supply crisis that could kind of upend this entire thing. But yeah, that's definitely the case. And it's interesting to hear that you're seeing that. And even like the fiber
We are.
optics is such a great example of like they're not investing even in like the components that make the components within the data center. They're investing in the stuff that connects all of this data together, because that data is also needs to, it gets processed there, but by virtue of being the cloud, it also needs to move around the entire world all the time on these cables. And we're going
Exactly.
to require, in order to make that feasible, these kind of like visions of what this technology could do. It requires exactly that. So I think it's a great example.
This is just maybe just a side point. You mentioned cool it. When I think of data centers, that's exactly what I think about. I think about liquid cooling and other types of environmentally safe being its own market, right? Environmentally friendly protection of data centers. But when I think of data centers, I also think, how are they being cooled? And that in itself is also a physical asset. It's not just the physical building itself. It's also, what are the kind of adjacent or ancillary investment opportunities to these data centers too, or other digital infrastructure
100%.
investments.
It's interesting, like as it relates to the environmental side of it, it's like, I've been covering, so kind of in the last boom of like environmental businesses, I was more of a real estate reporter and real estate technology. I moved onto this beat in around 2024. And like, I would say the kind of vibe has moved in a lot of ways away from kind of ESG focused investing, or
Definitely.
like
ESG was
framing it
so
that way.
2018, 2019.
Exactly. And I think we're in a world now where that's less like sexy, but what is sexy, and it's funny how this kind of switches, is like, okay, now we want to talk about energy independence. We want to talk about, yeah, like utilizing our national resources. It kind of frames it in that that vibe that we're in. And obviously, again, and I don't want to like be a broken record, but like if energy prices go really high, it makes a lot more sense to have solar panels. You don't have to be like, a tree hugger to want that. You can want that purely out of like acquiring energy.
Yes.
Um, and it could have the side effect of then boosting a lot of this. I mean, at the same time, it's also been boosting nuclear energy, which is a kind of more controversial but renewable-ish energy that also obviously has really big implications for energy independence. So it is really funny how, yeah, and I mean, this was in and I forget the specifics of the fund, so I don't have that in front of me, but like this was an environmentally focused fund as well that then generated this return that is probably the best high profile return a private equity firm has had on an investment in a long time. I mean, 15x is in 3 years is
In
just out
3 years.
of control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's a big payday for whoever made that decision. That's for damn sure.
Well, what's cool about it too is it is part of this like broader push, and we don't need to go into this, but like of like, employee ownership. I think using ownership in quotes because what they're doing is essentially they set aside a pot of money in the actual money that KKR is making, and they kind of helped pioneer this in the industry. Set aside some money so that when this sells, actually some of the employees that are there actually get a payout directly. The idea is to kind of like align the incentives of the portfolio company and the like private equity firm to like maximize the value. And in this instance, I mean, yeah, when you have a 15x return, you're able to give like pretty much everyone like hundreds of thousands of dollars in bonuses, which is, so I just to say, because you were saying like, great payday for them, they would definitely want to highlight that they're actually sharing the payday a little bit as well, which is, an interesting kind of counter narrative, but also maybe a PR narrative about kind of private equity. But anyways, that's another rabbit hole for another day.
Positive spin, though. I like that.
Yeah.
And that's a great setup and a great way to profit share, let's say. You
Sure.
mentioned private credit.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure if we were going to try and hold the bull back any longer, or if we're just going to let it run now. Or maybe should I say, is it a bear? I don't know. You tell me. Private equity versus private credit, right? What's the state of play right now? Is private credit at risk of a bubble, or has the time come and gone? In your perspective, right? I feel like one day I'm reading one thing, the next day I'm reading another. What's your view?
I mean, I think in some ways that like uncertainty is like just the reality of where we are because, private credit existed before the GFC, before, 2008 and all of that, but it really kind of came into its own after that as banks were kind of taking some of the riskier lending off of their books. And
Yes. And it's had a major renaissance the last few years.
exactly. And really, to be honest, like, it was already having a bit of a renaissance, and then interest rates rising. made it so that it would even be a better investment, and it would have a better, and also spreads widening, which is, complicated macroeconomic stuff, but just to say that like it was a better and better investment over time, especially compared to like public credit. So like, bonds or syndicated loans, stuff like that. So to bring it back, it's the reason there's so much confusion out there is this asset class has never gone through a real liquidity crisis yet. Credit, that's what credit does. It builds these massive, it powers these massive booms, and then it gets too far over its skis and it tumbles in one way or the other. Eventually, I mean, the thing with private credit, I think there's kind of two sides to the story here. There's one side, which is like private credit is, it's less transparent than public credit. I mean, it's in the name. It is harder to understand how assets are doing. Even if you're an LP investor into something, you're not necessarily getting like this kind of detail you get as a bond investor, in a bond. It's transparent, less transparent. It's harder to get the money when you need it. It's harder to trade. You have to sell assets, which could then kind of cause asset prices to like tumble down. And it has there's a lot of creativity involved in it, which is a good thing until it's a bad thing. As in, like, people can be very creative in how they structure loans and how they allow companies to fail or succeed. And, there's a worry that some of the like covenants of the loans, those actual kind of agreements might be too lenient. So there's that side of it. There's the industry side, which is kind of like, we're the best at, we're better than banks at picking investments, which like, you could believe that, not believe that. We'll see.
Yeah.
But the main argument that they have is this is actually purpose built to not have a crisis, to not kind of create these runs on the bank that happen in, traditional credit markets.
Mhm.
And it's kind of funny, the same things that are creating the headlines, these redemption kind of like, they're not really gates. They're like essentially like, after 5% of the money, they're like not letting any more out of these vehicles that have been marketed to wealthy people, through their wealth advisors. The idea is that actually having those limits on how much you can withdraw like stops the kind of, it's a wonderful lifestyle bank run where everyone is running to get their money out of the bank because they're worried it's going to collapse. And that the industry's point is like that should actually protect it creates the bad headlines, because investors are like, I wanted my money and I don't get it. But it also, again, this is the industry point of view, it protects it from it kind of fully unraveling the way a more liquid market could. Um, Now, there's also leverage that goes to, there's banks that lend to the private credit funds. There's insurance companies that invest in private credit. So there are
Which is a
potential
big market right now.
100%. And these are areas of potential contagion for sure. But the industry's perspective, and I think it's valid, or at least a fair point, is this is different than other times in that like the way the money, where the money comes from and how you can take it out is different. It takes longer to get your money back, and that might actually protect from things really going haywire. But the reality is no one really knows. I think what I find really fascinating is the industry with these wealth products is now starting to kind of say like maybe people weren't totally clear on how liquid or not liquid these were. Maybe people had an assumption they could get their money out better. Maybe the marketing, maybe it was the way a financial advisor explained it. And so the fact that the industry is admitting any level of like not even fault, but like that things aren't like smooth sailing, I think is fair. And it is a sign of like a bit of a change in perspective. But yeah, it's a hard question to answer, and it's something I'm working on every day. I mean, I talk to bears, I talk to bulls, and I think they both have some pretty valid points. And the reality is, we're just gonna have to wait and see kind of how it plays out. I will say, I will. Here's the one prediction I'll make:
Go ahead.
we will continue to have heightened redemptions. I will pretty much guarantee that. I'll go out on that limb. I think we'll have heightened redemptions from these funds that kind of hit those 5% caps again, just because the times like these are opening up while this is still in the news. So the people that weren't paying attention but have it in their portfolio are now paying attention. And I assume that means more people will take their money out. The other thing I'll say too, and this will maybe bring us into like the SaaS stuff, is like private credit is very, you know, a lot of private credit is actually kind of for private equity deals. So it's like to, fund these
Say
deals.
more.
And that's kind of how some of these shops were created is they were kind of like, oh, we have a private equity arm. Let's have a credit arm to kind of fund either our deals or other people's deals.
Kind of like an Apollo.
Apollo, exactly. Now, what's funny is Apollo at this point actually focuses more on like investment grade credit. So it would be kind of lending really big amounts to bigger investors. But yes, that's a great example of it. Um, it's just like it's a distinction that Mark Rowan likes to make a lot. Most people talk about private credit. They talk about a $2 to $3 million market of these kind of largely like sponsor backed loans, private equity loans to back private equity acquisitions.
Sure.
He talks about a $40 trillion market that includes all this investment grade rating and assets. So it is kind of funny. They've almost found their own separate way to talk about it. But again, so the SaaS stuff though is that this so many of those private equity deals in 2021 and 2022 were for software companies. They were because everyone was like, oh, low labor costs, and recurring revenue. Companies are giving money over and over and over again, for their CRM product or whatever it is.
Right.
So as a result, it's very overexposed, both private equity and private credit, to the software stuff. Now, on the private credit side, the concern is that a lot of these companies could go belly up or not be able to pay as kind of AI gets in the way of their operations. On the equity side, it's funny. It's like it's both a lot riskier because credit you usually can recover some asset, some way if things go belly up. Equity, if it does, you can't. But you can also get those 15x paydays. I mean, again, that's kind of an absurd payday, but you can have a big payday that will maybe make up for the 3 or 4 companies that didn't perform as well. So there's also a question. Everyone's focusing on private credit and software, and it's valid because it's also more like shorter term potentially. But there is a question too of what's going to happen with private equity and these software companies. Who knows? I mean, again, another area where who knows whether AI really is going to be able to take over all of these kind of things that software companies do now. I've heard skeptics and I've heard people that are like, oh, it's already happening. It's over. So who knows?
We've had that conversation on this podcast many times. I don't think it's over. A lot of our guests don't think it's over. In fact, they think it's here, but it's not takeover per se. So just before we move off the private credit topic, I just want to get your take as well. What are the risks, right? The publicity around private credit right now is mercurial at best, right? Like I said, one day it's one thing, one day it's another. Are the risks the investments themselves, right? As you say, SaaS or software and technology based? Or is there like a black mark, not necessarily on, but maybe above or hovering around the industry right now, right? Like, private equity, talk about something that's here to stay, right? Private equity is here to stay. And private credit is too, but it seems that the negative PR around private credit just like exists a little bit more. Why is that? And what are those risks?
Yeah. So I would say, there's kind of like in the short term, it is not really the assets that are the issue right now.
Right. Okay.
Defaults are inching up, but like, there was a story I saw, I won't say what competitor, but like 25, in a fund owned by one of the biggest fund operators, a $25 million loan defaulted. That is not a story until people are focusing on private credit. Loans default every day. And the default risk is only like inched up. So the short term and the performance of a lot of these software companies is actually, they're still continuing to do really well, in the short term. It's the medium and long term where there's a little more concern about the underlying assets largely. Now, like again, the SaaS apocalypse or whatever people want to call it. Now there have been some high profile like credit, issues over the last year. Kind of some, bankruptcies, some of them involving alleged fraud. And like some of those were private credit, some of those were bank loans, funny enough, but it all kind of ended up on private credit, one way or not. It ended up kind of being talked about that way, which is
Yeah.
But what I'll say is like I think the risk. I think there's like two things with the risk. That's like at a higher level. One is like, again, is the private nature of it and the like ability to kind of, privacy. Yes, it means you share less information about the underlying loan, which then makes it harder to understand as an investor how that is actually doing, if I'm really in a good, investment or not. A,
Yeah.
there's that element of it, but then there's also a whole private infrastructure around it. There are ratings, but a lot of those ratings are not publicly released. And we know ratings agencies were also kind of a scapegoat. Well, not even a scapegoat. I mean, they were kind of a contributor to the GFC last time around in that kind of big 2008 crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's concern around that privacy. There's concern around the fact that, some of these big investors are going to like buy assets in order to keep the prices high. Like, you know what I mean? Like because it doesn't happen out in the sunlight in the way that in the public markets do, maybe things don't crash as fast, but maybe there's a lot more people like hiding things, like when someone's about to come over and you didn't clean up in time and you're throwing everything in the
Shove it
closet.
in the cabinet.
Exactly. And in the cabinet, like, could that be happening? It's a possibility that is the case. And then there's the other risk, which is really around the retail channels and around this idea of liquidity, around these kind of, essentially, institutional investors were the basis of how these private markets companies raise money. Over time, they've put so much money into private equity and private credit that they are starting to slowly reduce their amount of investments into these big firms' funds. That has, at the same time, the industry has kind of created these products for like the quote unquote mass affluent, your B creds, your owl, blue owl kind of BDCs,
Yeah.
et cetera. And these are sold through people's financial advisors. And like the question is, are people aware of how liquid or not illiquid these are? They call them semi-liquid funds because you can take out a small amount. You could, if you wanted to leave during good times, you almost certainly will be able to leave. People won't be redeeming their assets, so you could take your assets out and get your money back. But during challenging times, like right now, people are starting to put up those walls, those kind of those barriers to exit. And that is, I think, where a lot of the concern is. But it's also, again, back to our earlier point, it's also where the industry is like, we did that on purpose to stop things from kind of doing a spiral down. So, it's interesting. I mean, I think you're right. I think there's the assets. Yes, people are worried about software. Maybe depending on, where oil is in 2 weeks, maybe that'll flip to people worrying about, the hard assets and the energy assets, et cetera, and the data centers. We'll see. And so there is that worry, but really, I think the black mark is actually on the industry, how it operates, and in some ways that I could see why they're valid. I also could see why the industry is valid. Again, I'm in that same kind of confused place in a way of wading through these different narratives when we're in frankly a new version of an old story, and we're not really sure where it ends up.
I think you said it there. It's a new version of an old story. The beat goes on, right? If you're talking to a Mark Rowan or any other CEO or of, a Josh Harris, right? Like if you're talking to these people, they're going to just stare at you and say, what's the problem, right? We're making money. It's how it's always operated. And it's very easy to see it that way. I'm not saying people should see it the other way. It's just very easy to see that this is just a pillar of the financial services industry. I'm just so interested because it's so curious that, private credit just seems to see its name dragged a little bit more than other industries in a different way, which actually brings me to private equity recruiting. Talk about mercurial. Talk about high profile. On cycle recruiting is now gotten. I won't be the one to say so out of hand, but it's become so competitive that we're talking year and a half, 2 years out, pre-MBA, junior year of college, 1 year into an analyst program in banking. And you have people like Jamie Dimon saying, if we find out that you're doing this, then you'll just be fired on the spot. But we also have, the op-eds, the anonymous articles that come through Business Insider or eFinancial. I work in private equity. This is how toxic it is. Yet at the same time, people want to apply 2 years in advance to know what their future could potentially hold to get the exposure. Talk to me a little bit about on-cycle recruiting at private equity and what you're seeing right now.
Yes. So on cycle, it's a pretty absurd process. I think people in the industry agree with that at this point. Like it's this thing where essentially, people are looking for a job, yeah, 2 years in advance before sometimes they even started their summer or started their first job out of school at a bank.
Exactly.
And what was really crazy is so last year there was one firm that actually went before students had even graduated from college. And the understanding that I had was what stopped other people from going was how bad the kind of reputational hit would be of the fact that students are missing their graduation dates in order to go recruit for a job 2 years in advance. I mean, it is absurd. It is.
Mind-blowing
And
concept.
and I think it's something, frankly, it's kind of a like tragedy of the commons type thing where it's like everyone wants the best talent. And if they go, well, then I have to go. If they're in it, then I need to be in it. Whoever's
Absolutely,
first
that's
to
what it
get the
is.
best person, the best bite out of the apple. And what's interesting is I think, and we can get to Jamie in a second, because it's funny for somebody who doesn't cover banking. I've been thinking a lot about Jamie Dimon over the last year, but
You're not the only one.
yeah, that's for sure. But what happens is you're now recruiting people basically without any idea of how they operate in the real world. Yeah, they had a summer internship, but what are they like after 6 months on the job? Do they have any real experience? And I think what I heard from a lot of firms is that they like, and people in the industry is like, we're sick of recruiting these kids and them not like working out. Um, but we feel that we have to do this to win. Now, then there's examples like Blackstone, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, decided we're not doing on cycle. We're going to run our own process starting in like March. So still very in advance, over a year in advance of your start date, but it's not like, it's a little bit more measured. Um, and now, so it's kind of funny is I feel like when Jamie Dimon then comes out and says, this is absurd. Like, why are these kids recruiting? It's unethical. A lot of these firms are recruiting for end up being JP Morgan's clients down the line. They might be working on a deal with this firm and
Exactly.
have a in their pocket have it now. I haven't heard any actual real examples of like issues around that, but it's real. Jamie was like, this doesn't make any sense. This is absurd and we'll fire people. Now, Goldman Sachs had tried a version of that, a less kind of Jamie Dimon-esque version of that a couple
Yes.
years ago.
I remember this.
And
Yep.
my understanding is that kind of didn't really, I mean, on cycle kept happening earlier, so it didn't really work in the
Well,
same
it
way.
didn't
This
deter.
one
Right.
kind of created a detente where the industry decided, you know what, we'll agree with this. I believe, off the top of my head, I don't remember. I think it was Mark Rowan was the one who was kind of like the first to say, we're not going to do this, and Apollo. And what that created was a bit of a pause. And I think it's something the industry kind of wanted. They kind of wanted to not be recruiting kids that were like, again, not even stepping foot into a real office yet, other than their internships. And so the industry basically everything paused this year up until January when it kind of kicked off right with the new year. Still very far in advance. But I think the on cycle world is kind of changing a little bit. I think we'll see next year for sure. I don't have any indications. I'm sure there are people at JP Morgan who have gotten jobs. I have no indications that anyone's been fired or disciplined for that. I mean, that'll be a
Right.
big story if that happens and
Yeah,
someone
we haven't
can,
seen
can
that
land
yet.
that.
Yeah.
But like, I think that's kind of where we're at is like Jamie was able to push the ball forward a little bit, push
From
things,
his position, of
from
course.
his position. And I think now we'll see. Yeah. I mean, and then there's kind of the other side of this. So there's the whole on cycle element of just like they didn't want to be doing it this way. So this actually kind of is a blessing in disguise for a lot of the industry. Um, a lot of the students were actually pretty mad about it because they'd been prepping for it, which makes sense. It's interesting though, because then there's at the same time, there's this question of what does AI mean for white collar jobs? And like, yes, people are focusing on my industry, journalism. They're focusing on public relations, they're focusing on, in some ways, recruiting as well, but more so from I think like we had an interesting article about like resumes and how kind of resumes are becoming like generative AI talking to generative AI. But anyways, all that is to say,
I've had an episode about that.
I love that. I got to go back into the archives and listen to that one. But all that is to say, there is a big question of what is the junior talent need for PE in the future. So right as PE has kind of created a pipeline for talent, institutionalized a way to get into this industry as it's grown, it's now being totally shook up again by AI because maybe you don't need, six sales guys with, I mean, the joke is they played lacrosse in college. I know people in my life who played lacrosse in college, so I'm not totally, making fun of them, but that's the joke. Why do you need these guys that are Excel spreadsheet masters when you can have AI do that? And maybe you need one data scientist who's in an investment seat. I mean, that's kind of a thing I've heard about. I need to work more on kind of firming that up. But like,
Yeah.
maybe they need different people. And so there's also that question of like maybe slowing down off cycle gave them some time to rethink what their junior talent needs are. The question then is like, okay, what's the path for medium? And there's so many questions that opens up. But it is really fascinating for sure.
Well, I think you just alluded to something where the talent pool might vary, as you say, and what roles do we actually need as private equity or assembling a team, but also what is the talent level, right? What does the new median talent level look like if on cycle, two things, if on cycle recruiting is being impacted, right, 2 years out, does that move the bar in any way, in any direction? But second, the AI bit that you mentioned, right? If AI can do certain parts of a job that other individuals don't necessarily need to do anymore, what skills are required? Are private equity now able to hire more talented and more niche skills, that are required from an investment or sales or deal making perspective? Or are they hiring people that are, as you say, more data science driven, that can work with the AI to help drive PE as the fund? So to me, I see a question as well that is now cropping up of, is the median talent bar moving in one way or another?
I mean, almost certainly higher. I mean, it's been moving higher, as in like even before the AI and the on cycle change, these kids a lot of people are deciding they want to be in this industry when they're in, high school. And they have to join freshman year, the investment club, in order to get this job, freshman year of college. And it's kind of it's this elevated, it's continuing to get more and more elevated. When I went to school, I graduated undergrad in 2015. So, it's been 10 years,
Me
but a
too.
while. It's not that long.
Yeah.
The only kids who knew really, really what they wanted to do freshman year were like pre-med. Like that was kind of the only lane that you had to be in freshman year. And it feels like that's already changing. And so I'm sure the talent level, I think the one thing that maybe makes the industry happy is like they're going to be able to at least evaluate you based off of your work product over 6 months, or some element of the work that you've worked on over 6 months actually in the seat, and so they can actually like, they're not looking at you as like a test taker and college student. They're looking at you as an actual investment professional. So, but that also raises the bar. You actually, you can't just be really good at studying for the tests and then be able to do a good well in your modeling test. You actually need to be able to like prove that you've done something with your time. So it almost makes the tryout time longer. And then with AI, I mean, I think you totally encapsulated it. It's like, I think there's a question of, I think it probably will go both ways, where like having some level of technical skills or even be really good at AI prompts might be a way to set yourself forward, or even maybe a different way roles develop over time. Who knows? But then there's also the thing where like the sales skills, the relationship building skills might also become more important than ever, because that's how you might actually stand out, is your ability to kind of keep your clients close and informed and feeling comfortable. So it's kind of funny. It's going to be really good both for introverts and extroverts, to make it incredibly simplified answer to that. But it's kind of funny. Yeah. And again, like all we talked about, we kind of don't know. We kind of don't know what next week brings, let alone next year. So this could all be a totally different conversation next time we chat, Jesse.
This has been a pontification podcast, really minimal conclusions drawn, but that's okay. I think that's what these things are for anyway. Probably a great place for us to wrap up. And I think just the last point is, as we continue to think about recruiting, as well as how off-cycle recruiting in private equity will be impacted as well, right? Not just the median talent bar, but what does just your standard lateral hire look like at these companies or in these instances as well? Now that on-cycle dynamics are changing so aggressively. So another point that you and I will talk about, but it ends in a question mark.
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. It's the same exact kind of question, which is like, I mean, in a way, it's the same uncertainty that we're kind of living in and talking through right now is also why, in a way, off cycle maybe is kind of more the play these days, as in you don't really know what your business is going to be in a year and a half. If I told you a year and a half ago that software is a dirty word, even though we were still all using our AIs, et cetera, like that would have been a big surprise. That would have been a counter narrative. Now it's like taken as gospel. And I think a lot of firms are feeling, it's harder and harder to be certain about what the future holds on an economic level, at a geopolitical level, at a technological level, that I think off cycle is already, I think, becoming more and more relevant because they're realizing it's better to know what you want to hire for than it is to just try to get the smartest person from Harvard. I think that same uncertainty that has me, pontificating over here, has both of us pontificating and taking our crystal balls out, is also maybe actually a beneficiary of kind of off cycle and of people, taking their time before they jump into this and actually developing some level of expertise or specialty that will then hopefully be valuable at the time that you go for it. Now, obviously, there's a lot of arbitrage in that, but hey, we're all kind of, again, we're all in that uncertainty. We're all in that big question mark right now.
Most definitely. Yeah, this has been great. I think this has been a really fun conversation, and thank you so much for being on. And it's a topic that we don't get into a ton either. So this has been super informative. Yet, as we have just agreed, just a good discussion to see what happens next.
For sure. I totally agree. I told you, I warned you beforehand, I like to yap, Jesse, and I think we fulfilled the quota of getting some words here, getting some words together. And, I think it's a very interesting time to be in either of our seats here, as kind of people to the side, but also directly related to these really big industries going through kind of massive society changing one way or the other changes. And it'll be really fascinating to see kind of where things lead.
Most definitely. I will close by saying if off cycle is the move, then that obviously means great things for me and my business. So
Bravo.
That's the direction I hope it goes in. Well, thanks so much for being here, Alex. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your insights and your opinions and your perspectives. And I will hopefully speak to you again soon.
Yes, definitely, Jesse. Looking forward to it. I would love to come back once I have some more stuff to talk about. Really appreciate it.
Alrighty. Take care. Thanks again. That's all for today's episode of Searching Smarter. If you found this conversation valuable, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, keep searching smarter.